Today, we're really fortunate with a lady who is UMO History Department teaching some of the best subjects we have about women's history, about 19th century American, about the slavery and Reconstruction era. We're going to have a great time with Professor Mary Freeman, who is a Columbia PhD, and I'm hoping that she'll tell us a little bit about what it's like to defy the U.S. Supreme Court, among other things.
Well, thank you, Alan, for that fantastic introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here, especially on one of these precious late spring, beautiful evenings in Maine that we can sometimes only count on one hand. So I really appreciate you being here. I'll also add that despite having spent some time away from Maine, I grew up down in West Bath on the coast. So driving in today, I felt really at home, seeing the lobster boats in the harbor, and just really feels like, a familiar landscape. So I'm really thankful again for you all for hosting me. So as you can see, I'm going to be discussing today one of the most popular and celebrated topics in Maine's history, which is our state's abolitionist heritage. The title of my presentation today speaks to the idea that while we know that Maine was deeply involved in the debates about slavery that shaped U.S. politics in the decades leading up to the Civil War, knowledge of this history is often shaped as much by myth and memory, sometimes romanticized, as it is by historical research that's grounded in archives and primary sources. And I know as people involved with the local historical society, I'm preaching to the choir here tonight. So this evening, I'm going to be exploring aspects of Maine's history with slavery and abolition. And in the process, I'm going to look at the complicated relationship between myth, memory, and history when it comes to this topic, especially focusing on Mainers' involvement in anti-slavery activism and the Underground Railroad. So just to introduce what I'm going to be doing tonight, I'm going to be looking at 3 common assumptions, or maybe to be a little bolder, even myths, about Maine history that tend to downplay Maine's historical ties to slavery while elevating or celebrating our state's abolitionist heritage. I'm going to show how historical research complicates these assumptions. This does not mean that everything that we think we know is wrong and that I'm here to tell you how wrong it is. I just want to show you how some of these assumptions tend to oversimplify or even romanticize the story. The truth is often stranger than the fiction, actually. It's really fascinating. And we'll see how historical research adds layers and nuances to our understanding of these topics. So I'm going to start here with this quotation by David Blight, who is a well-known Civil War historian who's written a lot about the history of the Civil War, but also the memory of the Civil War. He's a historian. He still teaches at Yale. So in this quotation, he says, "Caution especially must be applied to determine just how much we fashion usable pasts, histories that reflect our desire for a particular kind of lineage, individual or collective." And he was writing specifically about the history of the Underground Railroad here, which is our topic today. So this idea, first of all, of a usable past evokes the connection between the past and the present, and how history often is not just about documenting what happened in the past, but also helps us to understand our present moment. Of course, using history to understand the present can be very constructive and helpful. We want to avoid repeating past mistakes. But in certain cases, as he's pointing out here, we have to also be conscious of why certain stories are more appealing than others, and make sure that we are not ignoring evidence that might complicate those stories. This quotation also suggests that we are sometimes tempted to present ourselves in a more favorable light, to kind of stand in the present and look for heroes in the past that we can claim as part of our lineage. As we'll see, this observation is especially relevant to the topics of slavery and abolition in Maine's history. Let's see, next. So my first assumption that I'm going to complicate a little bit today is this statement. Maine was a free state. Slavery did not exist here. So we know that by the time national debates over slavery peaked in the mid-1800s, leading up to the Civil War in 1861, slavery no longer existed in Maine. But during the colonial era in the 16 and 1700s, there were elite Mainers who owned slaves in Maine. The enslaved population was quite small numerically. There was no plantation agriculture in New England, unlike in the southern states or colonies at that point, or in the West Indies. But slavery was still significant. Slaves fulfilled a variety of working roles in Maine, ranging from farm laborers to crafts workers to house servants. And slaves afforded slaveholders prestige, and many of Maine's wealthiest elite members of society had strong economic ties to plantation slavery elsewhere in the Americas, especially in the West Indies. So I brought two sources to illustrate this early history. So slide, please. This first slide is a bill of lading, or basically a receipt from 1719 for a female slave who was imported to the Maine coast from Barbados. What I find really fascinating and disturbing about this document is that I know it's impossible to read from where you're sitting, and it's even impossible to read when you're close to it. But when you actually, dig into the text on this document, there's no name for this woman. It doesn't tell you what her name was, and she's only identified by a physical mark. So if you look over here, there's this Y shape, and that is a mark that was on her shoulder, and that's how she's identified. That's the only identifying information in this document, other than she was an enslaved woman. And this mark, we don't really know what it was. It could have been a scar or a brand. It could have been some kind of tattoo. We just don't really know anything else. What we do know is that this woman was one of 5 enslaved people who originally boarded the ship in Barbados, but she was the only one of those 5 people to survive the journey. She reached the Maine coast. She was brought to port, basically very near what is now Kittery today, so very southernmost part of what is now Maine. And she died only 3 weeks after she left the ship. So next slide, please. This second source is connected to the first. This is Sir William Pepperell. Those who may have some familiarity with southern Maine, Biddeford, the Pepperell Mills, this is the same family. He was a prominent early resident of Kittery, and he made his fortune by trading lumber and salted fish from the Maine coast to sugar plantations in the West Indies. His ships would return to the New England coast with sugar and rum produced by slave labor that would then be distributed into the New England economy. What we have here is an oil portrait that Pepperell commissioned to showcase his wealth. And this style of colonial oil portrait is almost emulating European aristocracy, right? He's got this beautiful red, striking outfit on. He's holding a scroll. He's standing in front of what we can only imagine are his vast lands behind him. So this is really an example of a member of Maine's early colonial elite society who is projecting this image of wealth to the world. And that wealth is based on enslaved labor in the West Indies. And he's also the person who imported that enslaved woman from Barbados in 1719. After she came to Kittery and then died only 3 weeks later, Pepperell wrote to the merchant who had supplied the cargo, and in that letter he chalked up the misfortune to, quote, deficient clothing so early in spring, and apologized to the merchant for his financial losses. So the kind of takeaway here is that even in Maine, you see human beings being treated as property in the colonial era, and we have the historical record preserving a very expensive oil painting of Sir William Pepperell, but only a scrap of paper with no name for the enslaved woman. All right, so next slide, please. So Maine does, as part of Massachusetts, abolish slavery during the American Revolution, but Maine continued to have economic ties to the institution for a long time afterwards. This map, I know you can't read it and you don't need to. The main point is it shows the multi-directional trade routes around the Atlantic Ocean as of about 1750. So this is a couple decades before the Revolution. As you can see, it's a lot more complicated than just the triangle trade that we often learn about in our high school textbooks. Looking just at Maine and New England, kind of zooming in here to this area, we see an economy that's largely based on maritime trade, sometimes directly with Europe, but most often the coasting trade that's going down to the West Indies. So this really illustrates what's going on with Pepperell in that previous slide. Even though Maine abolishes slavery along with Massachusetts in 1780, the West Indies trade continued into the 19th century, especially in coastal port towns in Maine. And then into the 19th century, you have the development of cotton agriculture really booming in the southern states. And the cotton mills that developed in Maine in places like Lewiston and Biddeford were spinning that raw cotton from southern plantations into fabric. Maine ships and coastal communities were carrying that cotton from the south over to England, fueling the Industrial Revolution that's going on over there. So, basically we have the abolition of slavery, but we also have this complex economic network that's continuing to keep Maine kind of entangled in this slavery economy. All right, next slide. So moving ahead a little bit, now we're getting into the 19th century here. Maine also had political ties to the institution of slavery into the 19th century. Unfortunately, Professor Reardon, my colleague's lecture, was canceled here back in 2020, but he would have told you all about the statehood debates in Maine that led up to Maine voting in favor of its independence by 1819, and then we all have an idea of what comes next, right? We have this massive political crisis in 1819, 1820, even into 1821, over what the future of slavery is going to look like in newly acquired territory out west from the Louisiana Purchase, and how that gets tied up in the admission of new states as, quote, free states or slave states in the Union. So again, I've got another complicated map here that I'm not going to fully go into, that I'm happy to talk about it later on if you'd like to. The main kind of takeaways here, we see the country as of 1820 divided into free and slave states. The red numbers that you see at the top in some of these northern states are the dates when those states abolished slavery, so you can kind of track how that process unfolded. And what's happening as of 1820 is that Maine statehood is tied to the admission of Missouri to maintain the balance of power in the Senate between senators representing slave states and senators representing free states. At the time of Maine entering the Union in 1820, actually a lot of Mainers opposed this compromise. Even though they had voted in favor of Maine's independence a year earlier, they resented their statehood being tied to the expansion of slavery into Western territories. It's important to point out, though, that although this was a major political crisis and a lot of Mainers were against the expansion of slavery, this opposition was not necessarily tied to humanitarian concern for enslaved people. Mostly, Mainers were concerned that slaveholding politicians from southern states would gain too much political control and harm their state's interests. So we start to see some anti-slavery sentiment developing, but it's more politically motivated than from the kind of moral and humanitarian perspective. So to kind of close out this slide in this section, by the time Maine became a state in 1820, we know that despite entering the Union as a free state, the region had these long-standing social, economic, and political links to slavery. So that complicates this idea that Maine was just a free state and really didn't have much connection to slavery that kind of gets bandied about. All right, next slide. So my second assumption that I want to talk about is this idea related to abolitionism, that most white Mainers supported the abolition of slavery and supported equal rights for Black Americans in the 19th century. So following the Maine-Missouri crisis and up through the 1850s, most white Mainers and Northerners in general were not actively supporting ending slavery. For a lot of people, it was kind of out of sight, out of mind, or even that kind of not in my backyard attitude. If it's not happening here, I don't have to deal with it, we'll just let it be where it is elsewhere. And most people held very racist views of African Americans who they did encounter in their communities. Abolitionists were a very small minority of Mainers. And actually the first opponents of slavery in Maine were African Americans who were fighting the racist discrimination they faced in their own communities. Later on, they allied themselves with the national movement against slavery and recruited some white Mainers to join that cause. Next slide, please. So a lot of my research on this topic has focused on Black abolitionists who are centered in Portland, Maine. Portland was a major, hub of the maritime economy, and there were a lot of African American people there because Black men could actually find employment in sailing and maritime professions, which was sort of one of the only options that was really open to them at this point. And one of the characters who's really jumped out in my research is Reuben Ruby, who was a prominent Black activist in Portland and also was the city's first cab driver. So you can see this ad for his horse-drawn hack that he drove in Portland in the 1830s and 40s. So Reuben Ruby was one of the founders of Portland's Abyssinian Meeting House in the late 1820s. which became the epicenter of abolitionism in Maine all the way through the Civil War. Next slide, please. This is an image, a photograph of the meeting house, which still stands today. And again, I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but I'm happy to talk more if you have questions. It's a really unique building. It's one of the earliest still standing Black churches and community centers that still survives. And it really was very close to being lost, but has luckily received more attention and some funding in recent years to help keep it preserved and kind of draw our attention to this history. Connecting back more to the story of abolition, which is where I want to go today, Reuben Ruby was involved in inviting the well-known abolitionist leader William Lloyd Garrison to Maine. Actually, next slide, please. This is Garrison, and Garrison is probably most well known for founding the Liberator newspaper, which was one of the leading anti-slavery publications all the way through the Civil War. So Reuben Ruby in Portland invited Garrison to Maine in 1832. Garrison actually came back for another trip in 1833, and he came as far north as Bangor and Old Town. And with this visit, this was a pivotal moment for opening up the anti-slavery movement in Maine, kind of, again, bringing it from being something that was really contained within Maine's Black community that was looking for ways to shore up their own rights and position, to build a coalition that included some white Mainers. But it's important to remember throughout this talk today that abolitionists were still a very small minority of the overall population. They were pretty unpopular even all the way up to the Civil War. Next slide, please. So after Garrison visited Maine, abolitionists organized a state anti-slavery society in Augusta in May 1833. This is the first page of the Constitution for that society, which pledged that, quote, the fundamental principles of this society are that slaveholding is a heinous sin against God, and therefore that immediate emancipation is the duty of the master and the right of the slave. So they're arguing for emancipation now, no gradual anything. You know, this is a matter of right and wrong, of good and evil. So morally, it is the duty of the master and the right of the slave for this to be abolished immediately. In addition to immediate emancipation, the society also pledged, quote, to promote the intellectual, moral, and religious improvement of the free people of color and endeavor to obtain for them, as well as the enslaved, an equality with the whites in civil, intellectual, and religious privileges. So you can see the twin goals of immediate emancipation and equal rights for Black Americans speaking to the influence of Black activists like Reuben Ruby, who were pushing abolitionists to acknowledge not just the inhumanity of slavery, but also the pervasive influence of racism in American society, including in northern free states like Maine. So some of my most recent research has been trying to broaden the story away from just Portland and think about finding out more about abolition in other areas, including here in down East Maine. Abolitionist lecturers visited Maine regularly, starting in the 1830s all the way up through the Civil War era. But because so much of Maine's economy was based on the coastal trade with the South and with the West Indies, as abolition grew, there was also constantly a lot of opposition, even up to the Civil War. Next slide, please. So I have a kind of local case study for us right here in Gouldsboro. I'm curious if anybody has heard of Charlotte Hill before. Oh, great, okay. She was new to me, and I was really impressed. I am still really impressed by her. She was a Gouldsboro abolitionist and women's rights activist. She was born in 1833 in Ellsworth. Her father, Barney S. Hill, was a farmer and also was active in abolition. When I was driving in, I purposely came down, kind of on the Frenchman's Bay route, because he had a property on the bay that several abolitionist speakers who visited the area commented just on how beautiful the view was. Charlotte never married, but she made her living as a violinist, a music teacher, and a dancing teacher, which was a quite controversial choice for a woman in this time. And in the 1850s, she joined with two other young women, sisters Anne Jarvis Greeley and Sarah Jarvis, who were both from Ellsworth, to form a committee to bring abolitionist and women's rights speakers to Ellsworth. They invited speakers including Susan B. Anthony, who is like a household name, and Wendell Phillips, who is maybe a little bit less of a household name, but was a major radical abolitionist and proponent of women's rights. They also held a women's rights ball in Ellsworth on July 3rd and 4th, 1857. And I just love the idea of Charlotte, this violinist, using her talents for playing music to bring people together in a festive event for such a controversial topic in the 1850s. If you look at newspapers from the time from Ellsworth, they were generally favorable in their reporting on the lectures that Charlotte and her comrades brought in, but there were signs that the speakers were not always received kindly by everybody. One of the lectures was interrupted by a fire alarm, which was a false alarm, but the local activists would have taken it seriously because other anti-slavery speakers had been burned out and some injured or killed in outbreaks of mob violence, not necessarily in Maine, but elsewhere in the US. And unfortunately, the only image I have of Charlotte Hill is her gravestone. Next slide, please. She died at a very young age in 1863. She was only 30 years old, and she passed suddenly of diphtheria. But looking at some remembrances of her, which I'll read in a second, show her impact on the community and give a sense of her independent streak. But they also show that she likely faced some significant challenges and social ostracism for her radical views. So the first quote I have up here is actually by, it's a co-authored book by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage that they wrote kind of reflecting on the history of women's suffrage in the 1880s. And they were commenting on some of the women's rights activists they knew from Maine, including Charlotte Hill. About her, they said, some of her patrons threatened that if she persisted in bringing such people to that town and affiliated with them, so they're talking about these anti-slavery and women's rights lecturers they were bringing in, they would no longer patronize her. Very well, she replied, I shall maintain my principles, and if you break up my classes, I can go back to the seashore and dig clams for a living as I have done before. Tradition says the lecture course was a success. She continued her classes, and the neighbors danced as ever to her music. I mean, what a Maine woman, right? Gonna go dig some clams if you boycott my music business. The second quotation, this is from the Ellsworth American newspaper, and it's from her obituary. And this, again, kind of gives you a sense of how she was a fixture of the community, but she didn't always quite fit in with what people expected of a young woman in this time. So the obituary said, none deny that she was sincere, though she often walked over precedent and general usage. She was a friend to the slave, not in theory only. She gave liberally of her substance to them. She took the colored girl by the hand and bade her fairer-faced pupils withdraw their patronage if they disdained their companionship. So it's unclear exactly if this is speaking to a specific example, but it sounds like in her music and dancing teaching, she was looking to integrate her classroom to have white and black students taking classes together, which at that time was, again, quite controversial, even for a community that had some anti-slavery leanings to it. So I have more information I could go into here, but I'm going to go to the next slide, please, and get to my third topic today, which is about the Underground Railroad. So this is the sort of assumption or sort of softly romanticized idea that Underground Railroad activity was well organized and widespread among white Mainers. So as we've just seen, we can already start to see that consistent support for abolition and the Underground Railroad was not always easy to come by. And even for someone like Charlotte Hill, there was an element of grudging acceptance to her work in the community, and she still faced some friction for bending or breaking the rules that society had set for her. With the Underground Railroad, it is true that the issue of fugitive slaves galvanized more support for abolition, especially after the federal fugitive slave law of 1850, which legally required ordinary people to enforce the return of runaway slaves to their masters. If you know anything about Maine politics, you know that Mainers don't always like it when the federal government starts reaching its tentacles into people's everyday lives. So not only did they bristle, but they also, it was more than just the federal government. This felt like slaveholders in distant places telling them what to do. And another part of this is that as these laws make it even more difficult and dangerous for enslaved people to gain their freedom, those who are traveling through New England as part of the Underground Railroad network of abolitionists, are telling their stories, sharing their experiences. So Mainers who aided them as they were attempting to escape to Canada, where of course the law of slavery would no longer apply, they became more opposed to slavery. It kind of brought the issue home. So there's kind of this element of don't want people telling me what to do, and growing sympathy based on more and more exposure to the hardships that enslaved people experienced. So of all the topics I'm discussing today, the Underground Railroad probably has the most powerful presence in historical memory and storytelling. Next slide, please. An example of this is the North to Freedom Monument in Brewer. Has anybody seen this monument before? A few people. And it's a really interesting monument because it's kind of the only existing memorial or monument in Maine that's really dedicated to a topic related to slavery. Oh, my microphone is going in and out here. We will
battery problem?
stick with it until the end. Okay. So this monument, to me, is really interesting in kind of revealing some tensions between history, myth, and memory. The position and the subject of the monument were chosen based on local folklore around the Underground Railroad, having to do with a home that was associated with potentially having been a site where fugitive slaves were harbored or sought refuge on their way to Canada. But there's not a lot of solid corroboration in the types of archival records that historians typically rely on. That's not to say that it's false, it's just a little harder to pin down the kind of evidentiary basis for this storytelling. There's definitely, at the very least, a grain of truth. There certainly were fugitive slaves traveling via Bangor and Brewer on their way to Canada in the decades leading up to the Civil War. There are documented fugitive slave cases in the region, and there's some tantalizing evidence about how, Maine's maritime coast, its border with Canada, Calais especially as a site of potential movement back and forth. There is this historical story there. But there are also some kind of misleading aspects to the monument. You see the man, the central figure, emerging out of an underground tunnel, which kind of suggests a literal element to the Underground Railroad name, which was not a practice that fugitive slaves were using. There was no network of underground tunnels. In another part of the monument, there are railroad tracks, which is another kind of literal reading of Underground Railroad. There were enslaved people who rode on trains to escape, but again, it was not a literal railroad. It was much more kind of a loosely organized network of activists where people, enslaved people, were using whatever means and route that they could to escape when they could. There's also kind of a mixed message here where even though we have a black man who is rising out of the tunnel, he doesn't have a specific identity, and the local stories focus mostly on the white abolitionists who supposedly helped people like this man without mentioning, for example, the African American community in Bangor and Brewer that also likely participated in this activism. So I like to kind of close out with this memorial because I think it reflects something about our struggle to find meaning in the past, kind of circling back to David Blight's idea about being a bit cautious when we try to create a usable past from something like the history of the Underground Railroad. So why is this topic so popular? We all know slavery and the Civil War are some of the most difficult and controversial parts of American history. The Underground Railroad provides a hopeful and positive story for us to grasp onto, which, you know, is a natural way to explain why it's so popular. More something that we should perhaps look at a bit more self-critically is that there's a tendency to portray white Mainers today, as in the 19th century, as on the right side of history or above the racism that characterized much of the United States at this time. As we've seen, there are some admirable figures like Charlotte Hill, but we need to look at the full context and really understand this complicated history and its full layers and nuance. So my final slide here. In conclusion, I just have some kind of future directions, questions. How can we uncover the real history of Underground Railroad activism in Maine? Maybe some starting points. We should certainly continue to honor local memory, but we should also use a critical eye when we're talking about these sort of local folklore stories and try to support them with additional research and really think about, you know, what are we getting out of these stories and where could we stand to learn something more about our communities. We should remember that Underground Railroad actions were illegal. You were literally breaking federal law. They were often covert and they were often very dangerous. So it might be difficult to track down the kinds of really detailed source material that we might like to find. This doesn't mean that activism did not happen or didn't exist, but we should strive for a more complete picture of Maine's relationship to slavery and abolition. And just a few promising directions that I've touched a bit upon today. The history of Black activism in Maine is a developing area of knowledge for us. Exploring Maine's international border with Canada as a unique feature of our geography and something that we don't always get as much attention here as it does elsewhere in the US with respect to the Underground Railroad. And then finally, we've talked a lot about Maine's maritime economy as supporting its ties to slavery even through the 19th century, but there's also opportunities for fugitive slaves and Black Americans to use that economy to their advantage in this context. So I will end there. My microphone is also going out. So that's my cue. Thank you for listening. I look forward to continuing the conversation. And I have one final slide, if you could advance one more, just to give you a couple of resources. One is I'm actually one of the editors of the Maine History Journal, which is a joint publication between UMaine's History Department and the Maine Historical Society. So if you're interested in reading more, there's been several recent articles about slavery, abolitionism, the Underground Railroad in that publication. And also the Atlantic Black Box Project, which perhaps some out there may have heard of before, is a great public history project that is devoted to further study and uncovering more information about New England's complicated relationship to the history of slavery. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions. All right, I saw you over here first.
Yeah, just two quick ones. Is Cheryl, you showed her gravesite before, is that in Gouldsboro?
So I used the Find a Grave website, which is a fantastic website if anybody is doing genealogical or any kind of historical research. And it says that it's the Hill Cemetery. So I'd be very curious if people know where that is.
Yes. Right up there, off the road that comes, the first road in to Gouldsboro, the Hill Cemetery, but it's on private property. So one of the best ways to see what's in the Hill Cemetery is on Find a Grave, but also on the Historical Society website, with every cemetery is there.
And that probably is also the site where her family home was, I would guess, yeah.
Yeah, the second
They were
part.
one of the founding families for the Jones quadrant of Gouldsboro.
Oh, great, yeah, I'm curious to learn more, because I'm just learning about her as we speak tonight. I saw you over here.
I don't want to hijack your wonderful presentation, but you're talking about Maine, but I'm just wondering, when these poor souls get to Canada, their problems are just beginning, are they not? It would seem to me there's no welcome wagon up there. There's no home free. They're in very tough shape when they got there.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the examples that I read about actually related to another abolitionist who was visiting Gouldsboro and also other communities in down east Maine. She went all the way to Calais and actually crossed over the border into New Brunswick, where she experienced free soil. She wrote about a case where an enslaved man made it over the border from Calais into New Brunswick and then was pursued and brought back. So even getting over there, you were not necessarily safe.
Bounty hunters, probably.
Yeah. And then I would imagine, I think, again, this is sort of a history that is still developing, but there were established free black communities in New Brunswick, in Nova Scotia, famously the Black Loyalists from the American Revolution. So it's possible that former slaves could integrate themselves into those communities and perhaps, obtain a degree of anonymity that would prevent them from being returned to slavery. And there were also abolitionist organizations that acted as sort of missionary groups to try to send supplies or finance settlements of fugitive slaves in Canada, but those have, much humanitarian and charity work today, it's a mixed bag in terms of the matching the potentially good intentions to the outcomes of how well people were actually supported. So you're absolutely right that there was no welcome wagon, and it could be quite harrowing even once you make it across. In the blue fleece, yes.
In the blue. There's another hill cemetery, and it's in Asheville. So you guys who live around here know where Asheville is so close to Gouldsboro border. Okay, and that Hill family was very prominent, and they kind of started, I think, in West Gouldsboro, and sort of just moved a mile or two up the road.
Well, actually, Asheville, some of it's in Gouldsboro, and some of it's in Sullivan.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know Charlotte, she was the only daughter, but she had 2 or 3 brothers who lived longer than she did. She passed away quite early in her life. So again, you're introducing me to the local history here, but I would not be surprised if maybe some of her more extended family, yeah.
Is that Hill Cemetery in Asheville by the Asheville Church?
Right behind the Asheville Church.
Right behind the church. If you go there, be careful, because it's hard to get down to.
Right, I have gone there, I know what
Yes, right in front of.
I wanted to ask where the monument is in Brewer that you showed.
So that's an interesting question. This is another reason I'm so fascinated by this monument. It's in the Chamberlain Freedom Park. So there's also in the same complex, it's this very steep hill right across I believe it's the State Street Bridge. So if you're in Bangor, it's facing towards Brewer, it's a bridge on the left, that's how I know it. If you go across that bridge, it's right as you get into the Brewer side. It's this park kind of carved out of the side of a very steep hill. You've got Joshua Chamberlain standing on top, looking proudly out over the Penobscot. And then right next to this busy road, you've got this monument that nobody knows is there because you can barely see it as you're speeding by in your car. It's very difficult to get there on foot. So yeah, it's an interesting space as well as the sort of form of the monument. You can park, there's kind of a gas station behind the park. You can park in the gas station and access the park and very carefully make your way down to see the monument, but it's not a prime real estate, at least in my estimation. Yes. You
I yielded the gentleman.
Okay.
Thank you. No, second part of my question before, and excuse me for not knowing all the history, I'm relatively new to Maine, but what is the history of Abraham Lincoln up here? Does he have anything?
So probably the closest connection to Lincoln is that Lincoln's first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, was from Hamden, Maine, and there's actually a lot of his papers and correspondence and even some paintings are in the UMaine Special Collections Library. But Hannibal Hamlin had a little bit of a complicated relationship with Lincoln. He was brought in as the first vice president. He was a little bit more on the abolition side than Lincoln was, and a little apocryphal, but he pushed Lincoln towards the Emancipation Proclamation, and then when Lincoln was looking to get reelected, he was like, okay, I don't need you rabid abolitionists anymore. I need to court all these border states and potential Southerners coming back into the Union. So he went to Andrew Johnson, who was a total disaster, as we all perhaps know.
Is it not usual to have two Northerners like that?
That's a good question. I mean, I get the sense that in the 19th century, there was sometimes a little more willingness on a single ticket to work with someone who was more opposed to you than today. But I don't know. I'm getting a little shaky. I don't know. I'm getting into presidential history for sure. But yeah, Hamlin is probably the closest connection to Lincoln. And of course, I mean, Lincoln was very popular. Maine was a pretty hardcore Republican state from basically the formation of the Republican Party in the 1850s all the way up to 1950s. So Maine was an early adopter of the Republican Party and was very strongly in favor of Lincoln in both the 1860 and 1864 election. So there's a lot of support for him, though, you know, I don't even know if he visited Maine or if maybe somebody out there knows. Yeah.
I've heard and seen some evidence of a lot of African Americans that served as crew on a lot of the coasting trade in Maine. I wonder if there's any evidence about, any of the quote railroad traffic going by sea, or whether there are any abolitionist captains or that might have.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some isolated, documented incidents, but this is one area where it's really tantalizing but hard to pin down the evidence. I mean, being a black sailor in this time period, it was a great economic opportunity compared to what else was out there. It was one of the only occupations where you would be paid and treated in terms of your employment conditions basically equally with a white man. But it was quite dangerous. There's a lot of incidents of black sailors being kidnapped and sold into slavery if they're docked in a slaveholding port. But it's not to say that it didn't go the other direction. It's just hard, sailors were not always forthcoming and writing down all of their activities. So unfortunately, that's an area for research to develop, I think.
Wow, this is wonderful. I think we've all learned a lot. I think that it's great to have you, and here's a certificate of appreciation for your time here, and it's really wonderful. And here's a small honorary